Frankenstein is a work of fiction. A Gothic horror story begun as a rainy day distraction by an 18-year-old English girl, Mary Shelley. But where did the idea for Frankenstein come from? As the well-read daughter of two philosophers, and being all too acquainted with death, she could have made the whole thing up. Or had she heard the stories about the fabled German alchemist Johann Dippel on her travels? A man who claimed to have discovered an elixir of life, but who is also said to have dug up the bodies of the dead for his experiments, and to have created a monster. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston. Today we're exploring the mysterious historical figure Johann Konrad Dippel. He was a theologian, a philosopher, a chiromancer, a chemist, a physician to kings, and author of dozens of books, a perpetual wanderer. But was he also the real Frankenstein? Life in 17th century Europe was tough. It was a period of immense turmoil, revolution, religious conflict and bloody warfare. Into this chaos, Johann Dippel was born in 1673. The 30 Years' War had been over for a generation, but the devastation of the German lands, where almost half the population perished in battle or from starvation and pestilence, was still very fresh in the memory. He was born at Castle Frankenstein, a hilltop fortress in what is now central Germany, but at the time was in the Landgraviate of Hesse-Darmstadt, one of the many tiny fragmented principalities and duchies whose endless dynastic squabbling was the root cause of the region's self-destructive madness. His father was a teacher and Lutheran pastor who had taken refuge in the castle with his family to escape rampaging French soldiers in the Franco-Dutch War. He was sickly and frail and wasn't expected to live, and was hastily baptised just an hour after his birth. But against the odds, he did survive, and his father was able to leave the castle to return to being the pastor in the village of Niederramstadt, where his son attended school. At 18, he went to the University of Gießen to study philosophy. Like all students, he was recorded in the Latin archives with his name and place of birth. Straetaemontono Francostenensis, which simply means Johann Dippel from Frankenstein on the Bergstrasse, an old German trade route connecting mountain villages. He completed his master's degree in 1693 at the age of 20 with his ambitious thesis De Nihilo, about nothing. Even at this tender age, he had already developed a reputation for scholarly brilliance, but also for arrogance, rigidity, and a willingness, almost a compulsion, to disagree and confront, whatever the cost. It was a tendency that would get him into serious trouble many times. He started theological studies at Gießen, but financial problems meant he had to break off and work as a tutor to the children of a nobleman for a year. He returned to his studies at the University of Strasbourg, a city which had only recently been annexed by France and which still retained its Protestant German roots. He started giving sermons and private lectures on astrology and chiromancy, or the reading of palms, and began to make a bit of a name for himself. But he had to flee the city suddenly after brawling and getting into trouble with the city authorities. Some sources say he went on the run after killing a man in a duel. But like so many stories about this elusive man, I wasn't able to find any reliable evidence to back this up. He returned to Gießen to continue his theological studies, working as a tutor at the ducal court to pay his way. At the time, the Lutheran Church was divided into two broad camps: the Orthodoxists, who believed in strict conformity to the Lutheran creeds and liturgy and worship, and the Pietists, who held that living a good life was of greater importance. As a younger man, Dippel had been a firm orthodoxist, but he now did a dramatic about-face and became a staunch pietist. Writing under the pseudonym Christianus Democritus after the Greek philosopher who is said to have blinded himself on purpose to avoid worldly distractions interfering with his intellectual focus, Dippel began publishing pamphlets and books attacking and ridiculing orthodox beliefs. True religion, he insisted, was about love and self-sacrifice, not rigid dogma. And he expounded this view rigidly and dogmatically for the rest of his life. In The Hellish Doctrine of Orthodoxy and The Scourged Popery of the Protestants, books with Latin titles but German texts, he took up the radical and dangerous position of chief critic and accuser of the organised church. His emotionally charged writings won him many supporters across Protestant Northern Europe, who agreed with his views on trying to move to a more personal faith. But his scornful and haughty tone offended others, including many pietists, and created bitter enemies who sought to bring him down. He had multiple interrogations by the consistory, the ecclesiastical court in Gießen, which ended any hopes he may have had of getting his doctorate and a professorship at the university. So he turned his attention to alchemy instead. The idea that a serious scholar would turn to alchemy may seem hard to believe today, but at the time, medicine, philosophy, science and theology were less separate. Even Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, dabbled in the occult. And after reading through a few alchemical texts, ignoring the fact that his forerunners had been trying, unsuccessfully, for hundreds of years to turn base metal into gold, Johann Dippel immediately decided that gold making wouldn't be too difficult at all. After 8 months, he succeeded, creating a tincture that turned mercury into gold. Or so he claimed. And people believed him enough to lend him 50,000 florins to buy a house where he could continue his work. But over the next 3 years, unfavourable fate and the follies and messes of wretched laboratory workers combined to thwart his efforts to reproduce his magical tincture. And when his creditors lost patience, he had to hurriedly leave town again. So he decided to try his luck in Berlin. As the relocated capital of the newly created Kingdom of Prussia, it was a bit of a boom town, and he hoped to ingratiate himself with the king with promises of limitless riches. But after 6 months of getting nowhere, he offered his services to the Swedish king instead. In a letter which still survives in the archives, he complained about the Prussian court's monstrous crimes, and that he had no confidence in the king's foul servants who surround him on all sides. Dangerous words. And as Sweden needed Prussia as an ally in its conflict with Peter the Great's Russia, his offers were ignored. So he quietly got on with his alchemical experiments, trying to manufacture gold and create an elixir of everlasting life. He produced a balm that he promised customers would cure all current and future diseases, especially head diseases and women's diseases, assuring them of its efficacy by explaining that he had tested it on a dog whose head he had driven a large nail through. Dippel's most important discovery in Berlin, however, was entirely serendipitous. One of his assistants was working on producing his balm, but unbeknownst to him it was contaminated with cyanide. Then, a pigment maker working in the same premises while making up a batch of red cochineal paint picked up the contaminated powder and, to his surprise, produced an intense blue colour. Up to this point, artists had only had ultramarine blue, made from grinding up lapis lazuli from Afghanistan in a lengthy, laborious and extremely expensive process, which gave it the nickname Blue Gold. So Dippel and Diesbach's new Berlin Blue was a huge commercial success, and it was rapidly adopted for Prussian army uniforms, after which it became known as Prussian Blue. But rather than enjoying the rewards of his chemistry, he just couldn't stay out of trouble. In 1706, Johann Friedrich Meyer published a critique of pietism, and, imprudent as ever, Dippel wrote a response to this, which was critical of the Swedish king's position. Impartial thoughts, unparteiische Gedanken. But Dippel's thoughts were anything but impartial, and at the insistence of the Swedish envoy he was arrested and thrown into prison. He was only released when his old friend and fellow alchemist August, Count of Wittgenstein, agreed to stump up bail of 2,000 silver thaler. You would have thought that this narrow escape might have made him more cautious. But just a week after his release, he wrote to the Prussian king's advisers about his earlier letter to Charles XII, criticising Frederick, saying, "There is nothing in it other than what is complained about at every table, at every assembly, and in every street by the subjects themselves." Not something an absolute monarch wants to hear. And after getting a tip-off he was going to be arrested again, Dippel decided to leave town again, making his escape in a Swedish uniform. This time he made his way to Holland, where he continued to sell his wound balm and Prussian blue pigment and make a lot of money. At some point he decided it would boost his credentials to have a medical degree, so he enrolled at the University of Leiden. At the time, Holland offered some of the most advanced medical education in Europe, allowing public dissections of executed criminals, and Leiden's professor of medicine, Hermann Boerhaave, was described as perhaps the most celebrated physician that ever existed, if we accept Hippocrates. So when Dippel presented his thesis and was awarded his doctorate less than 3 weeks after enrolling, he must have been held in high regard. While in Holland, he expanded his catalogue of cure-alls by creating his universal medicine, which became known as Dippel's oil, a foul-smelling, dark, viscous liquid produced by boiling down the bones, blood, horns, claws, entrails, and other miscellaneous body parts of animals with potash and lime. Dippel claimed his oil could cure everything from epilepsy to gout, and that it would lead the sick to be overtaken by a pleasant sleep, 15 hours in sweet repose, with the face blooming and vivid in colour, from which they would arise fresh and healthy. With such claims it sold well, and he was able to buy himself a sizable country house with its own laboratory, even though it had no medicinal effects, and physicians had been producing similar concoctions for centuries. Dippel's oil made him so rich he even attempted to buy the place he was born, Castle Frankenstein. But just when things were going well for him, something happened again. We don't know exactly what, but there were rumours of bad reactions to his medicines and debts. But whatever the reason, he left Holland suddenly and moved to Altona, now a suburb of Hamburg, but then part of Denmark. In Altona he continued his alchemical quest for gold, but once again fell out with the local authorities, and this time he ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment on the Danish island of Bornholm for slander, and was carted off in chains to Hammerhus, now a romantic ruin, but then a formidable fortress. Was that it for the brilliant but outspoken Dippel? Was he destined to spend the rest of his days locked up in a cheerless stone prison, being buffeted by the relentless Baltic winds? No, Somehow he successfully petitioned the Queen of Denmark and was released on parole after 7 years. He went first to Kristianstad in Sweden as the guest of a wealthy merchant, and then to Stockholm as physician to the new Swedish king, Frederick I. He continued his alchemical experiments and as usual made grandiloquent claims about his abilities and the absolute certainty of him producing gold. And he just couldn't stop himself getting drawn into the same old orthodox pietist politics. The philosopher and theologist Emanuel Swedenborg met him several times and for a while was one of his most notable supporters. But later, like so many others, Swedenborg grew disillusioned and dismissed him as a most vile devil, who was bound to no principles and opposed to all, who would become angry with anyone for contradicting him. The growing number of people who agreed with Swedenborg's assessment eventually led to him being forced once again to leave the country. Next, he went to Liebenburg in the Prince-Bishopric of Hildesheim to complete some chemical experiments on medicine and other curiosities in solitude. But once again, he managed to stir people up, and he was expelled from Hildesheim after little more than a year. He then travelled to Berleburg in the county of Sayn-Wittgenstein, the seat of Count Casimir of Wittgenstein, relative of his old friend Count August. Casimir is said to have opened his small territory as an asylum to all those who were persecuted for their religion, by which means Berleburg and the whole surrounding county became a gathering place for the most diverse minds. After spending several months as the guest of Count August at Wittgenstein Castle, he returned to Berleburg, where he lived out the rest of his life, experimenting and writing. In his final year, he wrote a pamphlet, claiming to have discovered an elixir that would allow him to live to the age of 135. But it was a boast that was as empty as all his others, and he died in his bed in 1734, at the age of 60, 75 years short of his prediction. As you can imagine, for a man who had so many enemies, some of his contemporaries suspected he had been poisoned. Thereafter, his name slipped into obscurity, his chemistry forgotten, his theology becoming mere footnotes. In an ecclesiastical history published just 50 years after his passing, he was described as an incoherent and unintelligible writer who was a chemist into the bargain and whose brain seems to have been heated to a high degree of fermentation by the fire of the laboratory. We began this journey by asking if Johann Dippel was the inspiration for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We know that Dippel had a poor reputation in his lifetime, but this was mainly because of his bluntness and extreme views in his writings, and his tendency to disappear when his creditors needed paying. There were many who considered his wound balm and Dippel's oil universal cure to be genuinely beneficial, but also plenty who thought him a quack and a fraudster. That he spent much of his life conducting alchemical experiments in a futile quest for the philosopher's stone which would allow him to transmute base metal into gold wouldn't have seemed at all remarkable in his lifetime. Nor would his experiments on animals, both live and dead. Even his discussion in one of his books about transferring souls between dead bodies through a specially designed funnel wasn't unique or all that unusual. It's what alchemists often talked about. But what about the rumours that he used grave robbers to bring him fresh bodies for his diabolical experiments? There's no evidence one way or the other, but it is not beyond the bounds of possibility that he may have employed the occasional resurrectionist to further his chemistry. As for the rumours that he lost his Christian faith entirely towards the end of his life and consorted with the devil, I'll leave that for you to make your own mind up about. And reanimating a corpse to create a monster. Again, there is no evidence that he ever tried to do this, but the fact that he supported such theories in his own writings makes it a distinct possibility that he might have had a go. And if he didn't, it's plausible that there would have been rumours that he did. Rumours that would have lingered on in local memory, long enough for Mary Shelley to have heard them. It was in 1814, 80 years after Dippel's death, that Mary was returning to England after her elopement to the continent with Percy Shelley. The young lovers had stopped at the town of Gernsheim on the Rhine for 3 hours. Not long enough to make it to Castle Frankenstein 10 miles away, but long enough to have listened to some stories. There was no mention of any of this in her journals, however, and no mention of Castle Frankenstein in her novel. That's pure Hollywood. Johann Dippel was a man of immense contradictions. He was a visionary who co-discovered Prussian blue, a pigment that revolutionised art and made him rich. A man of semi-science who produced a foul-smelling oil from animal remains, which he sold with the promise of eternal life. And a theologian whose radical views brought him into a constant conflict with everyone. Today, Dippel is often reduced to a caricature, a mad scientist experimenting with dead flesh. But the historical record reveals a much more complex figure, a product of his time, a period of transition when science and alchemy, religion and mysticism were not yet mutually exclusive. Whilst there's no definitive proof that Mary Shelley based her novel on Dippel, his life provides a compelling backdrop to the story of Victor Frankenstein. Dippel's ambition, his unorthodox methods, his willingness to challenge authority, and the very castle he was born in all resonate with the themes of Shelley's classic. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of a real-life Victor Frankenstein, a man who, in his relentless pursuit of knowledge, blurred the lines between brilliance and madness. And it strikes me that Johann Dippel did achieve immortality of a sort, not through his elixir of life, but by his connection, however unlikely, with Mary Shelley and her creation, Frankenstein. He remains a truly fascinating historical figure, but so much of what's written about him is either factually incorrect or just speculation, making it hard to judge whether he was a complete charlatan or a misunderstood genius, or whether his life is a cautionary tale or a testament to the power of human curiosity. What do you think? Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this journey into the life of one of history's more compelling and mysterious figures. As always, I'd be very interested in your thoughts and any suggestions you may have for future topics. Please remember to subscribe and click for notifications, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.